Hi Year 2, this is Activity 3 and we're going to be comparing two versions of the same story. So I'm going to read from two different versions and afterwards you could choose two colours, maybe pencil crayons or felt tips, and you could use one colour to ring around different things that you think are very similar, that are similarities, and the second colour to go around things that you think are the differences between these two versions. So you might find differences, for example, in that one version has a lot more detail and maybe it's got lots of different words and different pieces of vocabulary used, and other differences might be that it has whole extra sections of story in it. So this is version 1, A Bear Called Paddington. Mr. and Mrs. Brown first met Paddington on a railway platform. In fact, that was how he came to have such an unusual name for a bear, for Paddington was the name of the station. The Browns were there to meet their daughter Judy, who was coming home from school for the holidays. It was a warm summer day and the station was crowded with people on their way to the seaside. Trains were humming, loudspeakers blaring, porters rushing about, shouting at one another, and altogether there was so much noise that Mr. Brown, who saw him first, had to tell his wife several times before she understood. "A bear on Paddington Station?" Mrs. Brown looked at her husband in amazement. "Don't be silly, Henry. There can't be." So this is from version 2 of the same story, but just a different version of it. And let's see if it's any different and if you can spot any similarities or differences. Mr. and Mrs. Brown first met Paddington on a railway platform. In fact, that was how he came to have such an unusual name for a bear, because Paddington was the name of the station. The Browns were waiting to meet their daughter Judy, when Mr. Brown noticed something small and furry near the left luggage office. "It looks like a bear," he said. "A bear," repeated Mrs. Brown, "on Paddington Station? Don't be silly, Henry. There can't be." So this is version 1 again. Mr. Brown adjusted his glasses. "But there is," he insisted. "I distinctly saw it, over there near the bicycle rack. It was wearing a funny kind of hat." Without waiting for a reply, he caught hold of his wife's arm and pushed her through the crowd, round a trolley laden with chocolate and cups of tea, past a bookstall, and through a gap in a pile of suitcases towards the Lost Property Office. "There you are," he announced triumphantly, pointing towards a dark corner. "I told you so." Mrs. Brown followed the direction of his arm and dimly made out a small, furry object in the shadows. It seemed to be sitting on some kind of suitcase, and around its neck there was a label with some writing on it. The suitcase was old and battered, and on the side in large letters were the words "Wanted on Voyage." Mrs. Brown clutched at her husband. "Why, Henry," she exclaimed, "I believe you were right after all. It is a bear." She peered at it more closely. It seemed a very unusual kind of bear. It was brown in colour, a rather dirty brown, and it was wearing a most odd-looking hat with a wide brim, just as Mr. Brown had said. From beneath the brim 2 large round eyes stared back at her. Seeing that something was expected of it, the bear stood up and politely raised its hat, revealing 2 black ears. "Good afternoon," it said in a small, clear voice. Good afternoon," replied Mr. Brown doubtfully. There was a moment of silence. The bear looked at them inquiringly. "Can I help you?" Mr. Brown looked rather embarrassed. "Well, no, as a matter of fact, we were wondering if we could help you." Mrs. Brown bent down. "You're a very small bear," she said. The bear puffed out its chest. "I'm a very rare sort of bear," he replied importantly. "There aren't many of us left where I come from." "And where is that?" asked Mrs. Brown. The bear looked round carefully before replying. "Darkest Peru. I'm not really supposed to be here at all. I'm a stowaway." And here's the last part of version 2. See if you can spot any similarities or differences. But Mr. Brown was right. It was sitting on an old leather suitcase marked "Wanted on Voyage," and as they drew near it stood up and politely raised its hat. "Good afternoon," it said. "May I help you?" "It's very kind of you," said Mr. Brown, "but as a matter of fact we were wondering if we could help you." "You're a very small bear," said Mrs. Brown. "Where are you from?" The bear looked around carefully before replying. "Darkest Peru. I'm not really supposed to be here at all. I'm a stowaway." So now have a look at the excerpts that are on the document and see if you can find any similarities and differences.